If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. Shadows over the Shang Realm. Part 1. The Shang Dynasty's Golden Age. The bronze vessels gleamed in the royal treasury of Anyang, each one a testament to the power that had dominated the Chinese heartland for centuries. The Shang Dynasty stood at its peak, commanding respect and tribute from lands stretching across the Yellow River Valley. Their capital city buzzed with activity as craftsmen hammered precious metals, scribes carved oracle bones, and merchants carried goods from distant territories. King Tang Shang sat upon his throne, surrounded by the symbols of divine authority that had sustained his dynasty for over 400 years. The Shang rulers claimed direct communication with the ancestors and gods, using elaborate rituals to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Oracle bones cracked over sacred fires, revealing the will of the spirits to guide royal decisions on everything from war to harvest festivals. The social order seemed as solid as the bronze weapons that equipped the royal army. At the top stood the king and his royal family, followed by nobles who governed distant territories in the dynasty's name. Skilled artisans created magnificent works of art, while farmers tended the fields that fed the growing population. Slaves, often captured in military campaigns, performed the heavy labor that kept the kingdom functioning. The Shang military machine appeared unstoppable. Their bronze weapons cut through enemy forces with ease, while horse-drawn chariots gave them speed and mobility that terrified their opponents. The king's warriors had conquered neighboring tribes and established tributary relationships that brought wealth flowing into the royal coffers. Trade networks connected the Shang heartland to distant regions, carrying silk, jade, and other luxury goods. Religious ceremonies reinforced the dynasty's claim to legitimacy. The elaborate tombs of deceased kings contained sacrificed servants, horses, and countless treasures, demonstrating the belief that royal power extended beyond death itself. The living king performed rituals that connected him directly to his ancestors, who were thought to intercede with the gods on behalf of the dynasty. Yet beneath this impressive surface, cracks were beginning to show. The very success of the Shang had created new challenges that their traditional methods struggled to address. The vast territory they controlled required constant military campaigns to maintain order, draining resources and manpower. Local nobles, growing wealthy and powerful in distant regions, began to question the need for absolute obedience to the central court. The rigid social hierarchy that had once provided stability now seemed to stifle innovation and adaptation. While the king focused on elaborate ceremonies and maintaining relationships with the spirit world, practical problems of governance received less attention. The burden of supporting the royal court, the military, and the elaborate religious rituals fell heavily on farmers and common people. As the dynasty celebrated its achievements and divine mandate, few noticed the growing restlessness in the Western territories, where a people called the Zhou were quietly building their strength and questioning whether the Shang truly deserved their position as rulers of all under heaven. Part 2. Seeds of Discontent. King Dishin sat on the dragon throne in the final decades of Shang rule. But the man who would become history's symbol of royal excess showed little interest in the careful balance that had kept his ancestors in power for centuries. Where previous kings had maintained harmony between ritual duties and practical governance, Dishin became obsessed with personal pleasure and extravagant displays of wealth that drained the royal treasury. The king's palace became a theater of indulgence. He ordered the construction of enormous pleasure gardens, complete with artificial lakes filled with wine, where courtiers could row boats and drink directly from the water. Musicians and entertainers filled the royal halls day and night, while the king ignored urgent reports from provincial governors about flooding, drought, and border raids. Officials who dared to criticize these excesses found themselves dismissed or worse. Di Xin's most controversial decision involved his relationship with Daji, a beautiful woman from a conquered territory whom he elevated to become his favored consort. Stories spread throughout the kingdom about her influence over royal decisions and the cruel punishments she allegedly devised for those who opposed her. Whether these tales were entirely true mattered less than the fact that people believed them and grew increasingly disgusted with their ruler. The burden of funding this lavish lifestyle fell squarely on the common people. Tax collectors appeared in villages with increasing frequency, demanding grain, livestock, and precious materials to support the court's endless festivals and building projects. Farmers who had barely survived poor harvests watched their remaining stores disappear into royal warehouses. Craftsmen found their finest work requisitioned for palace decorations they would never see. Meanwhile, the network of noble families that had traditionally supported the dynasty began to fracture. Regional lords, who had once competed for royal favor, now whispered among themselves about the king's fitness to rule. Some quietly reduced their tribute payments or delayed responding to royal summons. Others began looking westward toward the growing power of the Zhou, wondering if change might benefit their own territories. The king's neglect of military affairs proved equally damaging. While Di Xin focused on entertainment, border defenses weakened and veteran commanders retired without adequate replacements. The professional army that had once struck fear into neighboring peoples grew complacent and undisciplined. Reports of successful Zhou raids barely registered in the pleasure-obsessed court. Religious ceremonies, once the sacred foundation of royal legitimacy, became hollow spectacles, focused more on impressing guests than communicating with ancestral spirits. Priests noticed the king's distraction during crucial rituals, and word of his disrespect for sacred traditions spread among a population that had always believed their ruler's divine connection protected the entire kingdom. As complaints mounted and loyalty crumbled, the Shang dynasty's centuries of accumulated strength began to dissolve. The very foundations that had once seemed unshakable now appeared fragile. Creating opportunities that ambitious rivals in the West you're already preparing to seize through superior organization and genuine concern for proper governance. Part 3. Rise of Zhou clan in the West. In the rugged mountains and fertile valleys far to the west of the Shang capital, a different kind of leadership was taking shape. The Zhou people had lived in these borderlands for generations, originally as semi-nomadic tribes who gradually settled into agricultural communities. Unlike their eastern neighbors, they faced constant threats from hostile tribes and harsh weather, forging them into a resilient and tightly organized society. King Wen emerged as the Zhou leader during these troubled times across China. While King Di Xin indulged in palace luxuries, Wen walked among his people, listening to farmers discuss their crops and joining warriors in planning defense strategies. His subjects noticed this stark difference from distant rulers who demanded tribute but offered nothing in return. Word of Wen's hands-on leadership style spread beyond Zhou territories, reaching the ears of other regional leaders frustrated with Shang neglect. The Zhou military grew stronger through necessity rather than choice. Constant border skirmishes with northern tribes taught them tactical flexibility that the ceremonial Shang army lacked. Zhou soldiers learned to fight in small, coordinated units that could adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. They developed superior bronze-working techniques, creating weapons that were both sharper and more durable than those used by their enemies. King Wen understood that military strength alone would not challenge the established Shang order. He began reaching out to other regional lords who felt abandoned by the central government. These alliances started small, with trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, but gradually evolved into something more significant. Lords from territories stretching across western and central China began viewing Wen as an alternative to the failing Shang system. The Zhou developed a powerful narrative to justify their growing ambitions. They claimed their ancestors had received divine favor through virtuous leadership, contrasting sharply with the corrupt practices they observed in the East. This message resonated strongly with populations tired of heavy taxation and arbitrary rule. Zhou emissaries traveled extensively, spreading stories of King Wen's fairness and competence to anyone willing to listen. By the time Shang officials began noticing Zhou activities, the Western clan had already built an impressive coalition. Their territories controlled crucial mountain passes and trade routes, giving them both strategic military positions and substantial economic resources. More importantly, they had created a functioning alternative government that many saw as more legitimate than the decaying Shang administration. The stage was now set for a direct confrontation between old and new orders. King Wen's careful preparations had transformed the Zhou from marginal border dwellers into serious contenders for national leadership. The question remaining was whether the Shang would recognize this threat before it became unstoppable, and how they would respond to this challenge from the West. Part 4. Brewing Tensions and Imprisonment. King Discontent watched from his palace towers as reports arrived from the Western territories. The Zhou clan had grown too bold, their influence spreading like wildfire through regions that should bow to Shang authority. What began as distant rumblings now demanded immediate attention. The Shang king's advisors whispered concerns about King Wen's growing coalition. Trade routes that once filled royal coffers now diverted through Zhou-controlled passes. Tribal leaders who previously set tribute to the Shang court now sent envoys to King Wen's modest capital instead. The careful balance of power that had sustained the Shang for generations was shifting beneath their feet. Discontent decided on a bold move that would either crush the Zhou threat or expose his own weakness. He invited King Wen to the Shang capital under the pretense of honoring him as a loyal vassal. The message arrived with great ceremony, praising Wen's leadership while subtly demanding his presence at court. King Wen faced an impossible choice. Refusing the invitation would confirm his rebellion and justify immediate military action. Accepting meant walking into obvious danger, but it might also demonstrate confidence and buy precious time. After consulting his advisors, Wen chose to accept, trusting in his reputation for wisdom and the political costs of harming such a respected leader. The journey to the Shang capital revealed the dynasty's continuing grandeur. Massive walls surrounded gleaming palaces, while bronze vessels and jade ornaments displayed wealth beyond imagination. Yet beneath this splendor, Wen observed signs of decay. Overtaxed farmers worked exhausted fields, while nobles seemed more concerned with luxury than governance. Upon arrival, Discontent received King Wen with elaborate ceremonies that masked growing suspicion. For weeks, the two leaders engaged in careful diplomatic dance, each measuring the other's strength and intentions. Banquets featured subtle tests of loyalty, while hunting expeditions became opportunities for private conversations that could either forge alliances or expose treachery. The pretense finally collapsed when Shang spies intercepted communications between Wen and his Western allies. Confronted with evidence of his expanding coalition, King Wen refused to dissolve his alliances or abandon his growing movement for reform. Discontent's response was swift and decisive. House arrest in a fortified compound within the capital. The imprisonment backfired spectacularly. Rather than weakening Zhou resolve, Wen's captivity transformed him into a martyr for change. His supporters throughout the Western territories rallied around his imprisoned figure, viewing his sacrifice as proof of Shang tyranny. Stories spread of Wen's dignity under confinement, his continued wisdom despite adversity, and his unwavering commitment to just governance. Meanwhile, Wen's son, later known as King Wu, assumed practical leadership of the Zhou coalition. Young and energetic, Wu lacked his father's diplomatic restraint, but possessed fierce determination to secure his father's release and continue their cause. The Zhou movement, rather than crumbling without its leader, grew stronger and more militant. Pressure mounted on Discontent from unexpected quarters. Several Shang nobles, uncomfortable with imprisoning such a respected figure, urged the king to reconsider. Economic disruptions in the West threatened vital supply lines, while military commanders warned of growing unrest among their own troops. After nearly 3 years, Discontent released King Wen, hoping to demonstrate magnanimity while diffusing growing opposition. But the damage was irreversible. Wen returned to a movement transformed by his martyrdom, now united not just around reform ideals, but around personal loyalty to their suffering leader. The Zhou had evolved from political alternative to revolutionary force, and the Shang had inadvertently provided the catalyst for their own downfall. Chapter 2: The Battle for Heaven's Favor. Part 1: Strategic Conquests in the Wei Valley. King Wen had spent years building alliances and establishing the Zhou as a moral alternative to Shang rule. But his son would need more than righteousness to claim the throne. The fertile Wei Valley became the testing ground where the Zhou would prove their military might and political wisdom. The Zhou faced a complex web of smaller kingdoms and tribes, many still loyal to the Shang Dynasty. Some rulers genuinely supported King Discontent, while others simply feared his wrath more than they trusted Zhou promises. The challenge was clear: break this network of support without appearing as mere conquerors hungry for power. King Wu began with careful diplomacy. His messengers traveled to border states, carrying gifts and promises of fair treatment under Zhou rule. They spoke of the mandate of heaven and painted pictures of prosperity under righteous leadership. Some smaller rulers, already troubled by Shang demands for tribute and soldiers, listened with growing interest. When diplomacy failed, the Zhou military machine moved with precision. They struck at key Shang allies in swift campaigns that demonstrated both their strength and their restraint. Unlike the Shang armies, known for brutal conquest, the Zhou treated defeated enemies with unexpected mercy. Captured soldiers could join Zhou ranks, and local nobles who surrendered kept their positions under Zhou oversight. The psychological impact was profound. Each Zhou victory sent ripples through the region, weakening Shang credibility. If the mighty Shang could not protect their allies, how could smaller states trust their promises? Fear began shifting sides as rulers calculated their odds of survival under each potential master. The Zhou also mastered the art of strategic isolation. They targeted specific allies whose defeat would cut off Shang supply lines or communication routes. A fortress here, a river crossing there, each conquest was chosen to maximum effect while requiring minimum resources. King Wu could not afford a long, drawn-out campaign that might exhaust his forces before the final confrontation. Local populations watched these battles with keen interest. The Zhou treatment of civilians became legendary. Where Shang armies took what they needed, Zhou forces paid for supplies and protected local farmers. Word spread that these Western warriors fought with honor, respecting the common people whom heaven supposedly protected. By winter's end, the strategic map had changed dramatically. Former Shang strongholds now flew Zhou banners, while remaining loyal states found themselves increasingly isolated. Supply routes that once fed Shang armies now served their enemies. The network of support that had sustained Shang power for centuries was crumbling piece by piece. The success in the Wei Valley accomplished more than military objectives. It proved the Zhou could govern as effectively as they could fight. Local administrators kept their posts, trade continued flowing, and life improved under Zhou rule. This practical demonstration of their political philosophy would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. As spring approached, King Wu surveyed his expanded domain. The path to the Shang heartland now lay open, defended by fewer allies and supplied by disrupted networks. The stage was set for the final test of heaven's will. Part 2: King Wen's death and King Wu's ascension. The weight of kingship fell upon Wu's shoulders at the worst possible moment. His father, King Wen, had died just as their campaign against the Shang reached its critical phase. The Zhou forces had successfully expanded through the Wei Valley, but now faced the greatest test of their rebellion. Wu stood before his father's tomb, knowing that every eye in the kingdom watched to see if he possessed the strength to complete what Wen had started. The young king understood that his legitimacy depended on more than bloodline. Heaven had blessed his father with wisdom and success, but would the divine mandate transfer to him? Wu sought signs everywhere. Birds flew in unusual patterns. Rivers changed course. His advisors interpreted each event as either approval or warning from the celestial realm. The pressure was enormous, for a single misreading could doom the entire Zhou cause. Jiang Xia, the brilliant strategist who had served King Wen, became Wu's most trusted advisor. This grizzled old man possessed an uncanny ability to read both military situations and divine signs. When Wu expressed doubts about attacking the powerful Shang capital, Jiang Xia reminded him that hesitation could be interpreted as lack of heavenly support. The Zhou had committed too much to turn back now. Preparations intensified throughout Zhou territory. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons. Farmers contributed grain and livestock for the campaign. Allies sent messages pledging their support, but Wu knew that many waited to see which way the wind would blow. Success would bring them rushing to his banner. Failure would leave the Zhou isolated and destroyed. The king organized elaborate ceremonies to demonstrate his divine approval. Priests performed sacrifices and read the entrails of animals. Oracle bones cracked in patterns that supposedly revealed heaven's will. Wu made sure these rituals were public spectacles, designed to convince both his own people and potential enemies that the gods favored his cause. Military planning consumed Wu's days. Unlike his father's cautious approach, the new king felt pressure to act decisively. The Shang had time to recover from their recent losses and might gather new allies. Every delay potentially strengthened their position while weakening Zhou momentum. Jiang Xia counseled patience despite the urgency. He reminded Wu that successful rebellions required perfect timing. The harvest season approached, which would provide supplies for the army, but also meant farmers needed to tend their fields. Weather patterns had to be considered. Most importantly, the political situation within Shang territory continued to deteriorate, creating opportunities for the Zhou to exploit. Wu finally made his decision after a particularly striking omen. A red bird, symbol of the South and the Shang dynasty, was reportedly seen falling dead from the sky. Court interpreters declared this meant Shang power was ending. Whether the story was true or fabricated mattered less than its effect on morale. The young king issued orders for full mobilization. Zhou forces would march toward the Shang heartland, carrying the hopes of everyone who believed that heaven itself demanded change. Wu had stepped fully into his father's role, but now he had to prove worthy of it through victory or face destruction in defeat. Part 3. March toward the Battle of Muye. King Wu's mobilization order spread like wildfire through the Zhou territories. Within weeks, warriors from dozens of allied tribes began converging on the Zhou capital. These weren't just Zhou soldiers, but men from states that had grown tired of Shang rule. The Shu people from the west arrived with their distinctive bronze weapons. The Chang tribes brought their fierce mountain fighters. Even some former Shang vassals quietly sent contingents, though they kept their involvement secret. The Zhou camp buzzed with nervous energy. Blacksmiths worked day and night, forging spearheads and sharpening swords. Supply trains loaded with grain and dried meat prepared for the long march east. Young King Wu walked among his troops daily, learning their names and listening to their concerns. He knew that many of these men had never fought in a major battle. Their confidence in him would determine whether they stood firm or fled when the fighting began. Meanwhile, disturbing reports reached the Zhou from Shang territory. King Dishin had recalled his best armies from distant campaigns, but many soldiers were already questioning their loyalty. Shang generals whispered among themselves about the king's erratic behavior. Some spoke of recent omens, rivers running red, strange lights in the sky, crops failing despite good weather. Even within the Shang heartland, people wondered if heaven truly supported their ruler anymore. The psychological battle had already begun. Zhou agents spread stories throughout Shang lands about King Wu's righteousness and Di Xin's cruelty. They reminded people of the heavy taxes, the forced labor, and the brutal sacrifices that marked Shang rule. Word spread that the Zhou promised fair treatment for those who switched sides. Some Shang garrison commanders began allowing Zhou messengers to pass through their territories unopposed. As spring turned to summer, both armies began their final preparations. The Shang force was massive, perhaps 700,000 strong, but many soldiers served reluctantly. They had been conscripted from conquered peoples who held no love for Di Xin. Their weapons were impressive, their chariots numerous, but their hearts weren't in the fight. The Zhou army was smaller, maybe 300,000 men, yet they marched with purpose. Every soldier believed they fought for heaven's will. Their equipment was simpler, but well-maintained. Most importantly, they trusted their leaders completely. King Wu had surrounded himself with brilliant advisors like Jiang Zia, whose strategies had brought them this far. As both armies moved toward the inevitable confrontation, the very air seemed charged with anticipation. Farmers abandoned their fields to watch the massive columns pass. Birds flew in strange patterns overhead. The fate of China would soon be decided on a field called Muye, where two visions of rulership would clash in the most important battle in Chinese history. Part 4. The Clash at Muye. The morning of battle came with an eerie stillness that made even veteran soldiers nervous. On the plains of Muye, two massive armies faced each other across a stretch of grassland that would soon be stained with blood. The Shang forces looked overwhelming at first glance. King Di Xin had assembled nearly 700,000 troops, their bronze weapons gleaming in the early sunlight. War chariots stretched in long lines, and banners fluttered proudly in the breeze. Yet something was wrong beneath this impressive display. King Wu studied the enemy ranks from his war chariot, noting details that others might miss. Many Shang soldiers stood with slumped shoulders. Their formation looked loose, almost reluctant. These were not eager warriors ready to die for their king. Many were slaves, pressed into service, men from conquered territories who had no love for their Shang masters. The Zhou numbered only 50,000, but every man had chosen to be there. When the battle cry echoed across the field, everything changed in moments. The Zhou charged with frightening unity, their war chants rising like thunder. But the real shock came from within the Shang army itself. Entire units simply stopped fighting. Some threw down their weapons and walked away. Others turned their spears toward their own officers. A massive Shang advantage crumbled as betrayal spread through their ranks like wildfire. King Di Xin watched his empire collapse in real time. Soldiers he had counted on were now fighting against him. The chaos was complete and unstoppable. His trusted generals fled the battlefield, abandoning their posts without a second thought. The king himself, seeing the hopeless situation, made a desperate choice. Rather than face capture and humiliation, he retreated to his palace and set it ablaze with himself inside. The last Shang king died in flames, taking the dynasty's final moments with him. The Battle of Muye was over before midday. What should have been a grinding, bloody affair, lasting days, ended in hours. Zhou soldiers found themselves masters of the field almost without believing it. They had expected to fight the most powerful army in China. Instead, they witnessed its complete collapse from within. King Wu stood among the aftermath, surrounded by his advisors and the remnants of Shang power. The speed of victory was almost unsettling. Heaven had clearly chosen its side, but the magnitude of change was staggering. In one morning, the political landscape of China had been completely rewritten. The Zhou were no longer rebels challenging authority. They were the authority. The news of Di Xin's death spread quickly through the Shang territories. Without their king and with their army scattered, resistance melted away. City after city opened its gates to Zhou forces. The transition of power that followed would reshape China for centuries, establishing new principles of government that claimed divine approval as their foundation. Chapter 3, Forging a New Order, Part 1, Capture of Yin and Foundation of Zhou Rule. The gates of Yin stood open, their bronze hinges creaking in the morning wind. King Tang, the last Shang ruler, had fled during the night, leaving behind a city that had ruled China for over 500 years. Zhou soldiers marched through streets lined with workshops and temples, their bronze weapons gleaming as they secured the greatest prize of their campaign. The capture felt almost too easy after years of preparation. The Shang capital revealed its secrets room by room. In the royal palace, Zhou warriors discovered vast stores of grain, bronze weapons, and jade ornaments. More importantly, they found the oracle bones and ritual vessels that gave the Shang their divine authority. King Wu understood that controlling these sacred objects meant controlling the spiritual foundation of Chinese rule. Within weeks, Zhou administrators began the delicate work of absorption. They could not simply destroy what they had conquered. The Shang had built an intricate system of governance, trade, and ritual that connected hundreds of communities across the Yellow River Valley. Zhou leaders needed to make this system their own without breaking it completely. King Wu faced his first major decision: where to establish Zhou power. Yin represented the old order, heavy with Shang traditions and loyal populations who might resist change. Instead, he chose to build a new capital at Fenghao, further west in Zhou heartland. This location offered strategic advantages and symbolic importance, showing that a new dynasty would create its own center of power. The challenges mounted quickly. The Zhou controlled vast territories populated by dozens of different tribes and communities. Each group had its own customs, dialects, and local leaders. Some welcomed Zhou rule as liberation from Shang oppression. Others viewed the conquerors with suspicion or open hostility. Managing this diversity required careful diplomacy and firm military presence. Zhou administrators developed innovative solutions to consolidate their authority. They appointed trusted Zhou nobles to govern key regions while allowing local leaders to maintain some power under Zhou oversight. This approach balanced central control with regional autonomy, preventing widespread rebellion while establishing clear chains of command. The legitimacy question proved most complex. The Shang had ruled through claimed divine descent and ritual authority passed down through generations. The Zhou, as conquerors, needed different justification for their power. They could not simply claim inheritance rights or ancient bloodlines. They needed something more compelling, something that would convince both elites and common people that Zhou rule represented natural and righteous order. This challenge sparked the creation of their most enduring innovation. Zhou thinkers began developing a revolutionary concept that would reshape Chinese political thought forever. They proposed that divine approval did not belong permanently to any single family, but could transfer based on moral conduct and effective governance. This idea would soon transform how Chinese people understood the relationship between rulers and the divine mandate that justified their authority. Part 2. Introduction of the Mandate of Heaven. The Zhou faced a critical problem that would determine their dynasty's survival. Military victory alone could not secure lasting rule over millions of people who had lived under Shang authority for generations. The conquered populations needed to believe that Zhou rule was not just powerful, but right and proper in the eyes of heaven itself. Zhou scholars and advisors worked frantically to develop a convincing explanation for their stunning victory. They could not claim ancient royal blood like the Shang kings had done. Instead, they crafted something far more revolutionary: the Mandate of Heaven. This concept declared that heaven, the supreme divine force, granted the right to rule based on virtue and moral conduct rather than bloodline. According to this new doctrine, the Shang had lost heaven's favor through corruption, cruelty, and neglect of their duties to the people. King Tang, the last Shang ruler, had become a tyrant who ignored the suffering of his subjects and indulged in excessive pleasures while his kingdom crumbled. Heaven had grown disgusted with such behavior and withdrawn its support from the Shang dynasty. The Zhou claimed that heaven had chosen them specifically because of their moral character and concern for the people's welfare. King Wen, the Zhou patriarch, had demonstrated wisdom and benevolence in governing his own territory. His son, King Wu, had reluctantly taken up arms only when heaven commanded him to remove the corrupt Shang and restore righteous rule to China. This explanation served multiple purposes for the new dynasty. It justified their rebellion against established authority by framing it as divine commandment rather than mere ambition. It also established clear expectations for Zhou behavior, promising that they too would lose heaven's favor if they became corrupt or oppressive. The Mandate of Heaven introduced a radical idea that would echo through Chinese history for thousands of years. No dynasty could claim permanent divine approval. Heaven continuously judged rulers based on their actions, and any family could lose the right to rule if they failed in their duties. This concept made successful rebellion theoretically possible and even necessary when rulers became tyrannical. Zhou officials traveled throughout the conquered territories, spreading this message through speeches, ceremonies, and written proclamations. They pointed to natural disasters during the final Shang years as evidence that heaven had already begun withdrawing its support before the Zhou arrived. They contrasted this with the favorable signs that had appeared during Zhou military campaigns. The doctrine resonated powerfully with people who had suffered under Shang misrule. It offered hope that good governance would continue under the Zhou and provided a framework for understanding political change that emphasized morality over mere force. The Mandate of Heaven had transformed the Zhou from foreign conquerors into heaven's chosen instruments for restoring justice and order to the realm. Part 3. Reforms and Shifts in Governance. The Zhou rulers faced an enormous challenge after their victory. Winning battles was one thing, but ruling millions of people across vast distances required something entirely different. The old Shang system had collapsed, and the Zhou needed to create a new way to govern that would keep their empire together. King Wu and his advisors developed an ingenious solution. Rather than trying to control everything from their capital, they would share power with trusted allies. This became known as the feudal system. The Zhou king remained the supreme ruler, blessed by heaven's mandate, but he would grant land and authority to loyal nobles who had helped him win the war. These nobles received territories to govern as their own domains. In return, they owed the Zhou king military service, tribute, and absolute loyalty. Each noble became a local ruler in his assigned region, responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and providing soldiers when the king needed them. This created a web of relationships that stretched across the entire realm. The land redistribution was massive and carefully planned. The Zhou awarded the largest and most important territories to their closest relatives and most trusted generals. Smaller parcels went to other supporters who had proven their worth during the conquest. This system served two purposes. It rewarded loyalty while creating a network of rulers who depended on Zhou favor for their positions. The Zhou also made a surprising decision about their former enemies. Instead of destroying all Shang nobles, they chose to integrate many into their new system. Former Shang officials who demonstrated loyalty to the new dynasty could keep positions of authority, though always under Zhou oversight. This practical approach helped prevent widespread rebellion and allowed the Zhou to benefit from Shang administrative experience. New bureaucratic structures emerged to support this complex system. The Zhou established clear chains of command that connected the king to regional nobles and down to local administrators. They created standardized procedures for taxation, military recruitment, and legal disputes. Officials traveled regularly between the capital and outlying regions, carrying messages and ensuring that royal commands were being followed. These reforms transformed how people thought about government itself. Authority no longer flowed from ancient bloodlines alone, but from heaven's approval and the king's wisdom in distributing power fairly. Local nobles gained real authority in their regions, but they understood that their positions depended on maintaining the Zhou king's favor and fulfilling their obligations to him. The system worked remarkably well in its early years. Regional nobles had strong incentives to govern effectively, since failure might cost them their lands. The king could focus on major policy decisions while trusting his appointed nobles to handle day-to-day administration. This balance between central authority and local autonomy created stability that would define Chinese governance for centuries. As these reforms took hold, the Zhou had successfully created a new political order that satisfied heaven's mandate while building a foundation for long-term rule. Part 4. Pacifying the Realm and Divine Demonstrations. The Zhou understood that military victory was only the first step. Ruling China meant convincing millions of people that heaven truly favored their new dynasty. King Wu and his advisors knew they faced a delicate task. Many former Shang subjects remained skeptical, while regional leaders watched carefully to see if the Zhou would prove worthy successors. The new rulers began their campaign for hearts and minds through grand public ceremonies. In the capital at Fenghao, King Wu ordered elaborate sacrificial rituals that drew crowds from across the realm. These weren't mere spectacles, but carefully orchestrated demonstrations of divine approval. Priests announced favorable omens as smoke rose from altars loaded with precious offerings. The message was clear. Heaven smiled upon Zhou rule. Local nobles received special attention during these events. The Zhou invited them to witness the ceremonies firsthand, positioning them as honored guests rather than conquered subjects. Many of these leaders had served the Shang for generations, but the Zhou treated them with respect and dignity. This approach gradually won converts who began spreading word of the new dynasty's legitimacy throughout their territories. Weather patterns provided unexpected opportunities for the Zhou to demonstrate heaven's favor. When seasonal rains arrived on schedule, royal astronomers proclaimed it proof of divine blessing. Abundant harvests became evidence that the cosmos approved of Zhou rule. Even minor coincidences received grand interpretations that reinforced the mandate of heaven concept. The Duke of Zhou, King Wu's brother and chief advisor, proved particularly skilled at managing public opinion. He traveled extensively throughout the realm, visiting local temples and participating in regional festivals. His presence at these gatherings lent royal authority to traditional celebrations, while creating personal connections between the Zhou court and distant communities. Religious practices required careful handling. The Zhou couldn't simply abolish Shang traditions without causing widespread resentment. Instead, they adapted existing rituals to emphasize their own legitimacy. Ancient ceremonies honoring royal ancestors now included prayers for the Zhou dynasty. Local deities received new titles that acknowledged their place within the Zhou cosmic order. Regional resistance occasionally flared despite these efforts. Some Shang loyalists spread rumors questioning Zhou legitimacy, while others organized small uprisings. The Zhou response combined military action with propaganda campaigns. They crushed rebellions swiftly, but followed up with renewed ceremonial displays designed to demonstrate that heaven punished those who opposed the rightful dynasty. The strategy gradually succeeded. Communities that had initially resisted Zhou rule began participating enthusiastically in royal ceremonies. Regional leaders competed to host visits from Zhou officials, seeing such events as opportunities to display their own loyalty and importance. Public opinion slowly shifted as people witnessed the stability and prosperity that seemed to follow Zhou governance. These efforts created a foundation of popular support that extended far beyond military conquest. The Zhou had successfully transformed themselves from foreign invaders into legitimate rulers blessed by heaven itself. This achievement would prove essential as they faced the ongoing challenge of governing their vast new empire effectively. Chapter 4: Echoes Through History Part 1: Dynastic Challenges and the Eastern Move. The cracks in Zhou authority first appeared along their borders. Nomadic tribes from the north and west began testing Zhou defenses with increasing boldness. These were not mere raids for cattle and grain. The nomads sensed weakness in the Chinese heartland and pressed harder with each passing season. King Yu ruled during this dangerous time, and his troubles multiplied quickly. Internal rebellions erupted as powerful nobles questioned his leadership. Some whispered that heaven had withdrawn its blessing from the Zhou house. Others acted on these whispers, raising armies against their sworn ruler. The situation reached a breaking point when nomadic forces launched a massive invasion. They swept through Zhou territory like a flood, destroying towns and scattering defenders. King Yu's own allies abandoned him when the crisis deepened. In 771 BCE, the barbarian armies reached the capital itself. King Yu died fighting to defend his throne, but his death solved nothing. The surviving Zhou nobles faced a terrible choice. Their western capital lay in ruins, surrounded by hostile territory. The old power center could not be rebuilt quickly enough to restore effective rule. Without a strong base of operations, the dynasty would crumble completely. Prince Ping, the rightful heir, made a decision that would reshape Chinese history. He gathered the loyal remnants of the Zhou court and moved them eastward to Luoyang. This ancient city offered better protection and closer ties to supportive nobles. The move saved the dynasty from immediate extinction, but it came at a steep price. The relocation marked more than a change of address. It signaled a fundamental shift in Zhou power. The Western territories, source of the dynasty's original strength, were now beyond effective control. Distance made it impossible to govern the vast realm as before. Local nobles began acting with greater independence, knowing the king's armies were far away. The new eastern capital struggled to maintain authority over distant regions. Messages took weeks to travel between Luoyang and remote provinces. By the time royal commands reached frontier areas, local situations had often changed completely. This communication gap created a vacuum that ambitious nobles quickly filled. Regional leaders started making their own decisions about taxes, military service, and local laws. They still paid formal respect to the Zhou king, but this respect grew increasingly hollow. Real power shifted from the royal court to provincial strongholds across the kingdom. The mandate of heaven, once a source of unquestioned legitimacy, now became a double-edged sword. If heaven could withdraw its blessing from one ruler, it could certainly grant it to another. This logic began spreading among the nobility like wildfire. Each failed harvest or military defeat became potential evidence that the mandate was shifting once again. This fragmentation would only deepen with time. The eastern move had preserved the Zhou dynasty's existence, but it had also planted the seeds of its eventual collapse. China was entering an age when multiple voices would claim heaven's approval, and none would command universal acceptance. Part 2. The Mandate Under Siege. The eastern capital at Luoyang buzzed with tension as reports arrived from across the realm. Noble families who had once bowed before Zhou authority now questioned every royal decree. The king's messengers found themselves turned away at gates that had welcomed them for generations. What had begun as whispered doubts about Zhou legitimacy now erupted into open defiance. The Duke of Qi was among the first to test the waters. When a dispute arose over trade routes, he refused the king's arbitration entirely. Instead, he declared that heaven itself had grown tired of Zhou weakness. His armies marched under banners proclaiming divine approval for his cause. Other nobles watched carefully. If the duke could challenge the king without immediate punishment from heaven, perhaps the mandate truly was shifting. This pattern repeated across the Chinese heartland. The Duke of Jin claimed heavenly backing when he seized neighboring territories. The rulers of Chu went further, abandoning Zhou customs entirely and declaring themselves kings in their own right. Each successful rebellion emboldened others. The logic was simple, yet devastating. If these rebels prospered while the Zhou struggled, surely heaven was showing its preference. The Zhou court found itself trapped in an impossible situation. Every natural disaster became evidence of lost divine favor. Each military defeat strengthened their enemies' claims. The king's advisors desperately sought ways to demonstrate continued heavenly support, but their efforts often backfired. Elaborate ceremonies meant to show divine blessing appeared hollow when neighboring states thrived without them. Common people began choosing sides based on practical considerations rather than traditional loyalty. A farmer cared less about ancient bloodlines than about which lord could protect his crops and maintain trade routes. Merchants followed profitable opportunities regardless of political boundaries. The Zhou discovery that legitimacy required constant proof had become a weapon in their enemies' hands. The most dangerous development was how rival states refined the mandate concept for their own purposes. They argued that heaven judged rulers by results, not heritage. A weak king who allowed suffering clearly lacked divine approval. A strong lord who brought prosperity obviously enjoyed heavenly favor. This interpretation made the mandate portable, transferable to whoever could demonstrate superior governance. Regional powers began establishing their own diplomatic relations, ignoring Zhou protocol entirely. They signed treaties, arranged marriages, and formed alliances as independent entities. The king became just another player in an increasingly complex political game, rather than the supreme arbiter he had once been. By the middle of the Eastern Zhou period, the mandate concept had evolved beyond recognition. What began as justification for Zhou rule had become a tool for endless political transformation. Any ambitious leader could invoke heaven's will to justify rebellion, expansion, or reform. The Zhou had created a principle that would outlive their dynasty, ensuring that Chinese rulers would forever face the possibility that heaven might choose someone else. This constant threat of legitimacy challenges would define the coming centuries, as China moved toward an age where multiple kingdoms would simultaneously claim divine approval. Part 3. Spring and Autumn, Start of Division. The Zhou king sat in his palace at Luoyang, but his commands barely reached beyond the city walls. By 770 BCE, the once mighty dynasty had become a shadow of its former glory. The royal court, that had once commanded respect from hundreds of lords, now struggled to collect tribute from a handful of nearby territories. Across the vast Chinese landscape, ambitious nobles looked at their growing armies and fertile lands with new eyes. Why should they bow to a weakened king who could no longer protect them or provide meaningful leadership? The Duke of Qi controlled rich coastal territories and commanded thousands of warriors. the rulers of Jin possessed mountain fortresses and controlled crucial trade routes. These regional powers had grown strong while the Zhou king had grown weak. The transformation began quietly. Lords who had once traveled to Luoyang to pay homage started making excuses. Military campaigns that required royal approval proceeded without permission. Trade agreements between states ignored the central court entirely. The Zhou king found himself increasingly isolated, reduced to ceremonial functions, while real power shifted to the regional capitals. Duke Huan of Qi became the first to openly challenge the old order. In 685 BCE, he declared himself hegemon, claiming authority to lead other states in the king's name. This bold move sent shockwaves through the political landscape. Other powerful lords watched carefully. If Qi could claim such authority and face no consequences, what prevented them from doing the same? The concept of the mandate of heaven, once the Zhou's greatest strength, now worked against them. Regional leaders began interpreting heaven's will through their own success. Their growing territories and prosperous subjects surely indicated divine approval. Why should heaven favor a distant, powerless king over capable local rulers who actually governed effectively? Military technology advanced rapidly as states competed for dominance. Iron weapons replaced bronze. New siege techniques allowed armies to capture fortified cities. Professional soldiers began replacing farmer warriors. Each innovation spread quickly as states copied successful rivals, creating an arms race that the central government could not control or regulate. Social changes accompanied the political upheaval. Merchants gained influence as trade between states expanded. Scholars found employment advising ambitious rulers rather than serving the royal court. Artisans developed new techniques to meet military demands. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined early Zhou society began showing cracks. By 600 BCE, the fiction of Zhou supremacy had become transparent. Multiple states claimed hegemony simultaneously. Diplomatic marriages between ruling houses bypassed royal approval. Military alliances formed and dissolved without consulting Luoyang. The spring and autumn period had begun in earnest, named for the chronicle that would later record these tumultuous years. The stage was set for even greater chaos. As regional powers consolidated their strength and tested their military innovations, they prepared for conflicts that would make the current political fragmentation seem mild. The coming centuries would witness warfare on a scale that would reshape China entirely, as the weakened Zhou Dynasty watched helplessly while their former vassals fought for ultimate control. Part 4. The Warring States and the Mandate's Legacy. The chaos that followed the spring and autumn period would prove to be just the beginning. By the 5th century BCE, China had splintered into 7 major kingdoms, each claiming the right to rule under heaven's blessing. The Warring States period had begun, and with it came 3 centuries of almost constant warfare that would reshape Chinese civilization forever. These 7 kingdoms, Qin, Chu, Zhao, Han, Wei, Yan, and Qi, no longer pretended to serve the Zhou emperor in Luoyang. They called themselves kings, minted their own coins, and built massive armies equipped with new weapons like iron swords and crossbows. Each ruler claimed that heaven had withdrawn its mandate from the Zhou and granted it to his house instead. The concept that had once unified China now justified its complete fragmentation. The irony was striking. King Tang Wu had created the Mandate of Heaven to explain why his Zhou forces could rightfully overthrow the Shang dynasty. Now that same principle allowed every ambitious warlord to dream of becoming emperor. A peasant who seized a throne could claim heaven's blessing just as easily as an ancient noble family. This flexibility made the mandate both powerful and dangerous. Military innovations flourished as kingdoms fought for survival. Professional armies replaced feudal militias. Engineers designed new siege weapons and fortifications. Generals like Sun Tzu wrote treatises on warfare that would be studied for millennia. The constant competition pushed each state to become more efficient, more organized, and more ruthless. Yet beneath the violence, something remarkable was happening. Philosophers emerged to make sense of the chaos. Confucius taught that good government came from virtuous rulers who earned heaven's favor through moral behavior. Lao Tzu preached harmony with the natural order. Legalists argued that strict laws, not virtue, brought stability. Each school of thought wrestled with the central question: what made a ruler legitimate? The mandate concept evolved during these centuries of warfare. It became less about bloodline and more about results. A king who brought peace and prosperity clearly had heaven's blessing. One who brought suffering and defeat had obviously lost it. This practical interpretation would survive long after the warring states ended. The Qin kingdom, positioned in the West, watched and learned from its rivals' struggles. Its rulers studied the successes and failures of other states. They adopted legalist principles, built efficient bureaucracies, and created disciplined armies. Most importantly, they understood that the mandate of heaven belonged to whoever could unite China and bring peace to its war-weary people. By 230 BCE, Qin had grown strong enough to begin its final campaign of conquest. One by one, the other kingdoms fell to Qin's superior organization and military might. When the last rival surrendered in 221 BCE, China was whole again for the first time in over 5 centuries. The mandate of heaven had found its new holder, and the Zhou Dynasty's greatest legacy would live on to shape imperial China for the next 2,000 years.